threw him out of town. They took him to the top of the mountain on which their town was built, meaning to fling them off. But he slipped through the middle of them and went away.
Thank you. What a fascinating story that one is. I've titled today's message, Our Sacred Texts. And in the lectionary readings for this morning, the people that created the lectionary chose to juxtapose or put side by side these two readings of sacred texts. The first one in Nehemiah, where they gathered together and Ezra brought the book of the law of Moses, and the people asked him to read it. Now this was after the exile, and some of the people had lost the ability to understand Hebrew. So there were a couple of references in that passage to people helping the people to understand what was being read. It was kind of like if you were Catholic years ago and you went to the Latin Mass and didn't speak Latin, you were kind of at a disadvantage. Well, that's the context of that time. But they helped the people understand what was going on. It says at one point the people wept at the reading of their texts, and other people. And see, this is the Levites taught the people, this day is holy to the Lord, and they say, do not mourn or weep. The people wept when they heard the words of the law, so they were deeply touched emotionally by the reading of their sacred texts. And then in Luke, we hear of Jesus early in his ministry going to his hometown after he'd been ministering in Galilee and in Capernaum. We talked last week about his turning the water to wine. So this text today would be after that, after he turned the water into wine, after he'd done his first sign. He goes back to his hometown of Nazareth, goes to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and they ask him to read from the sacred texts. And he chooses a passage from Isaiah. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So today I hope we'll have a little fun with this today. Well, my subtitle is Jesus' Own Use of Scripture Understood Via Spiral Dynamics. Anybody ever heard of spiral dynamics here? Am I just the only one? So Bruce has heard a little bit, okay. So we're going to use this modern thing, and I'll explain it to you a little bit later. So both of the texts today are describing the reading of a sacred text, or the reading of the Bible, the Old Testament, right? Nehemiah, that text describes an event in the 5th and 6th century before Christ. Most all religions have sacred texts. And something of interest is that many of the world religions all started writing their sacred texts in the 5th or 6th century before Christ. It was a time when there was a lot of this going on. So for example, Nehemiah, the text we just read, was from the 5th or 6th century BC. Buddhism began about that same time. They began recording those precepts. Taoism with scriptures by Lao Tzu, at the same time Confucius lived in that time period, so Confucianism began around then. Greek philosophy was really getting going and getting off the ground, and the predecessors to Hindus also started writing things at the time. So a lot of activity in the 5th or 6th century as regards sacred texts. So it's like it wasn't just a Jewish phenomenon. People all around the world began recording sacred texts. It's interesting that it all happened in those couple hundred years. Now I want to talk about weather first this morning, okay? I even have my little pointer here so we can talk about weather. So I've always wanted to be a weatherman, secretly, not really, but I'm going to give it a crack today. So we've heard, if you watch the weather, you hear about weather models, right? You hear about when there's a storm coming. They have several different models that they'll run with the existing data of what's going on in the atmosphere, and they'll predict maybe what's going to happen. And this particular one is predicting a hurricane coming toward the United States, toward Florida here. Now, these weather models are observational models. What I mean by that is it would be really nice if you could, in these models, if you could take your mouse and click on that right there and drag it out here to see, and click on this one and drag it out here to see, and actually control the weather with your weather model. It would be nice if you could do that, but you can't do that, right? So that's why I call it an observational model. Weather models are just taking observations of current conditions and maybe just the recent history conditions, just the last week or two, and they project what's going to happen, what they think is going to happen in the future. They use a variety of data, and most of it is atmospheric data, stuff in the atmosphere. As more years of data are put into these weather models, we run these over and over and over, the forecasts, I can say since I was a kid, the forecasts are more accurate now than they used to be. And it's because they've accumulated more data into these weather models. Not always are they accurate, we all know that. Now another type of model is a climate model. And a climate model takes a longer view. So where weather models are just concern themselves with the recent past and the very recent near future, climate models have a much bigger data set. They differ from weather models in that they use other data in addition to atmospheric data. Stuff like ocean temperatures over time, glacial melting or glaciers forming over time. They can check that with ice cores. Chemical composition of the ice cores and cores that they take in the earth over time gives them an idea what the climate was at different points in our past. Even tree ring studies. Some trees that live hundreds of years, they can take a cookie, they're called, a slice of a tree, and examine the chemical makeup of the rings at different points in history, and that'll give them some clues about volcanic activity, what the atmosphere contained at that particular point in time. Ocean currents, they'll even include historical weather data from writings, when there were big events like the tsunami that hit Portugal a few hundred years ago. They combine all of that kind of stuff, plus things like heat being radiated away from the Earth and the solar radiation coming into the Earth. So there's a lot more data that goes into a climate model. And it's also an observational model, though. Like with a climate model, we can't control the weather, but we can make predictions about what might happen in the climate in the future based on all of this data that they stuff into the models. And just like with a weather model, like we talked about a minute ago, even though we can't grab these and steer the storms out to sea like we'd like to, we can, with a weather model, tell people in Tampa and then along the east coast of Florida, you guys better batten down the hatches because there's a hurricane coming. So even though we can't control the weather, we can control what we do in relation to that weather. And the same thing is the same kind of thinking in climate models. So climate scientists today are telling us what they think might happen in the next 100 years, and that's what we're in. We're in this debate about what do we do? Do we have any effect on that going forward? So just like we use climate models and weather models, social scientists create social models. And I never knew this for a long time, but they create social models, and they're also observational models. So they don't create models to steer humanity's future, but to pay attention to what we've gone through in the past, how society's developed, how culture's developed, and where they're headed. So I want to talk about this one model today. It was developed by Don Beck and Christopher Cowan, and they call it spiral dynamics. They've written a book by the same name, and they identify a number of things. They identify, and this work is based on work going back to the 50s by a psychologist called Claire Graves. They identify 8 stages, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and they color code them, and they represent those 8 stages with this spring-like device here. And if you see, the bottom stage is beige. It's called reactive, automatic, survival sense. So what this is it's saying going back in the early days of human history, we were mostly concerned with surviving. So most of your day, if you were alive in the beginnings periods of humanity, was spent, gathering food. Just you're concerning yourself with staying alive. And then as as we got better at that, we transitioned into this tribalistic, kindred spirit kind of society, where we band together into groups for protection and for community and so forth. Then after a while, we get into this red power gods phase. And I'll talk about these a little bit more as we go. But the idea when you look at this spiral is that you see beige here, but you see it up here, you see it here. You see red down here, you see red even way up at the top. See, all of these colors appear all up and down the spiral. So what I'm trying to get you to think about is don't think of these 8 stages as fixed stages. That you're either in this stage or you're not, or you're either in this stage or you're not. Because we tend to mix them up. And that's how we tend to live. There's considerable overlap, you could say, in the 8 levels. Now here's a quick overview of these 8 levels. The beige level, where a human society was basically instinctive, looking for food, water, procreation, warmth, protection, just trying to stay alive. What was the Bee Gees song? They were probably sang that Bee Gees song back then. Staying alive. That's what they're up to. And then after a while, we become more animistic. We start practicing rites, rituals, taboos, superstitions, folkways. This is when sacrificial religion starts to take off. We start becoming aware that there's more that impacts the way we live than just the physical realm. And then so that's when, like Rene Girard would say, at this point we would start practicing sacrifice, trying to appease whatever the gods were that were affecting the way things operate here. The red phase is a more egocentric or power phase, it's called sometimes. Gratification, glitz, I can't even read it from over here. Let's see. Conquest, action, impulsive, lives for now, heroes and victims. So we start adding these power attributes here in the red phase. The blue is authority, and this is what I really want to get at today, because this blue phase corresponds around the world to the 5th and 6th century BC in a lot of ways. The blue phase is when people started writing down in sacred texts things that they had learned in these phases. So when we read Nehemiah, written in the 5th and 6th century BC, he's writing in this phase here, but he's writing also with these things in the background, because that's how humanity developed through those things. Maybe I'll just move this down here. The orange phase is materialistic, consumerism, success, image, status, growth, winners and losers. Sounds a lot like the United States today, and that's what that is predominantly identified with. Green, we start to get into things like, being more egalitarian, meaning we recognize that in these other phases before, we've maybe repressed women, repressed minorities, and we start becoming aware that we shouldn't have been doing that, and so we become more egalitarian rather than complementarian. We pay attention to community, to become more aware of injustices, and try to do things to remedy injustices. The yellow, it even goes beyond that. We even consider today multiple realities. You see this in physics. People are talking about the multiverse and how are things structured out there. So we're asking bigger questions up here. And then the turquoise, holistic, getting a view of cosmic spirituality even, and how do all of these influences around the world impact societies going forward. So what I want to draw our attention to, though, is especially that blue phase where the sacred texts seem to appear all around the world. It's interesting that they all kind of came, not all of them, of course, but a lot of the major ones start taking place with that kind of social consciousness. Okay. Now, again, don't think of yourself, and you can apply these stages to yourself too, but don't think of yourself as just existing in one of these stages. For instance, you might have a very green attitude toward your family, very egalitarian, sharing, community-oriented, caring for one another. You might have that kind of approach to your immediate family, but at the same time hold a very red power, conquest, hero kind of attitude toward your nation and other nations. You know, thinking, well, we have to maintain this kind of an attitude toward nations in order for me to have this kind of a relationship with my family. At the same time, you might still hold a few superstitions and some magical thinking about how your world operates. So, you know, as an individual, you can exist kind of across the spectrum. And as societies, we can exist across these spectrums too. So, this is another way to think about it, that there are overlaps all around in these different colors, that we don't just exist in one place. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is all these stages are needed, and they're all good. We wouldn't get to these other stages up here if we didn't have these to go through, if we didn't go through these former stages. So I don't even like to talk to them as higher or lower. They're just, they're consciousness levels, or you know, what we become aware of. It's not that you're a better person if you're up here and you're a worse person down here. It's just because there are times when you're up in the green or yellow area that you need a little kick in the butt from these blue or red guys, you know. And so they interact with one another. So be careful not to think of these as rungs on a ladder. In other words, you know, see what I'm saying? I want to focus mostly on the blue stage, though, because this is where the sacred text developed, like that our readings were from today. The blue stage is where we learn morality. It's where we develop codes of conduct, where we set standards and values, and it's when we codify those in sacred texts, in writings. The Nehemiah text we read this morning is an example of an entire culture, the Jews, coming together around the reading of their sacred texts. They formed community around that text. That text was the glue that held that community together. So sacred texts are powerful. They contain laws, truths, values, and they provide a cohesive center for communities. They still can function that way today. And it's interesting to me that many different branches of the human family all kind of fell into this way, this realization at the same time. But we have to remember that these texts are an outgrowth. These texts that developed in around here were an outgrowth of these other stages. So the texts that were written down in the 5th or 6th century, and I'm not saying that this is just chronological here either, right? Because you know a lot of this exists today, but it just happens that sacred texts appeared when human societies began thinking about codes of conduct, morality, setting standards, truths and values. Those things are still very important. It's just that when they first appeared and started being written down, they would have included a lot of this kind of thinking, a lot of tribalistic thinking, us versus them thinking, tests for worthiness, sacrificial thinking. That all originated in the blue and the red stages down below here. So the beige, purple, and red worldviews down here are all included and embedded in these sacred texts that exist here, that appeared around here. So if we jump ahead to the 1st century when Jesus was reading this Isaiah 61 text in Nazareth, we see him reading from not exactly the same text, because Isaiah's text hadn't existed yet when Nehemiah was written, but he starts reading from the Old Testament canon. And he reads, "Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone." Everyone was praising Jesus. Well, he had just turned water into wine. That's pretty cool. He began healing and delivering people. So that's the way to get people on your side, right? Start doing amazing things like that. Then he goes back to his hometown in Nazareth. And verse 16 of Luke 4 reads, "When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him." Very much like the scroll was given to Nehemiah, back in Nehemiah, in that passage. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say that to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." The next verse, 22, is generally not translated very well in a lot of translations. A lot of translations sound like this one. This is the NRSV. "All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth." In Greek, the "spoke well" phrase can be translated that way, but it's not really that forceful. It's more like they just said, isn't this Joseph's son? It's more neutral than a lot of the translations represented it as being. So far, so good. Jesus is speaking to an oppressed people, a people who had been oppressed for centuries, scapegoated for centuries, and they were all pleased with this. All these things that he just read in Isaiah, good news for the poor, release of captives, setting oppressed free, giving sight to the blind, that's all really good news. But then Jesus gives them two examples from the Old Testament when they ask him to, because this is the way teachers would teach. They would read, they would sit down, and then they would begin to teach. The people commented, "Oh, wow, isn't this Joseph's son?" Like they were a little bit intrigued by him. But then in his teaching, he goes back and uses two examples. Sherry Ann read them. I won't bother to read them all again. But he reads two examples, one about Elijah and Elisha being sent to feed and heal foreigners, outsiders, in a time when Israel needed feeding and healing. So to elaborate on his reading, he draws in from their own texts some examples of being gracious to outsiders. And then he had stopped reading mid-sentence. So when he read this, and you guys have probably heard me talk about this before, but I'll come at it a little bit differently this time. "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me, sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release of prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And in Isaiah 61, he stops reading right there in the middle of a sentence. And he doesn't read "in the day of vengeance of our God." And you see, then he goes on and gives two examples about God not being vengeful. It kind of leaves you hanging there, the way he did that. And it would have left his hearers hanging. It would be like me reading today, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him." And we know there's good news after that. In this case, there was kind of bad news at the end of that phrase, and he didn't embrace it. He didn't read it. So in the language of spiral dynamics, what is Jesus doing here? He was exposing people who had a worldview that was predominantly purple and red, and who highly valued their sacred texts to a very green way of reading the text. These were people that were very respectful of their sacred texts here, but they were still very much thinking in us versus them categories, in remaining worthy in God's sight. They were very much thinking about reward and aggression, rites of passages. They were very cognizant of bloodlines. If you weren't a Jew, then you weren't the chosen people. You were an outsider. So when Jesus uses examples that don't comport with this kind of thinking, he's really asking them to consider their own texts, their own scriptures from this angle. That other people are equal with us, that we should participate with other people, we should be accepting of other people, we should be aware and tolerant of people even if they're not of our bloodline and even if they're not in our tribe. So Jesus wasn't rejecting the Hebrew scriptures, the sacred texts here, but he was being selective about how he used them. He wasn't rejecting the scriptures. He was finding examples in the Hebrew scriptures of a more inclusive and compassionate worldview. And at the same time, he was downplaying, but not rejecting, texts that promoted red and purple communities and their worldviews. Because he knew, I think, now he didn't know about spiral dynamics, or maybe he did if he knows everything in the future, but I'm not talking about Jesus, using spiral dynamics. I'm using spiral dynamics to understand what he was doing. Okay, so he knew that cultures needed to go through these phases to get to this. You don't just jump from survival to being pluralistic. There's a long road in between. There's a lot of stuff in there. When Jesus left out the God of vengeance, he was asking the Nazarites to do the same. But we know if we read the rest of the story, they weren't buying it. It says in verse 28, when they heard this, these are the two examples of Elijah and Elisha going outside Israel to help outsiders, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their own town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. So these Nazarenes from his hometown were not open to those green values up here. They were not going for it. They were not going to listen to that. Why? Because they were stuck in the red-blue values of expecting heroes and conquest and power heroes to come in and overthrow the Romans. That's what they thought was the Messiah was going to do. But Jesus knew something. He knew that that red-blue worldview was not going to serve them well in the next 40 years. And by AD 70, they were destroyed because they clung to that worldview. They clung to those red-blue values, or that red-blue view of the world, the way things work. So he was presenting them with a different, though familiar, it should have been familiar to them because it was in their scriptures. See, Jesus was not rejecting anything in Scripture. He was just pulling out of it parts that they had downplayed and elevating those parts to a more important place. When spiral dynamics says that when people reach this point here, that they tend to do one thing, one of two things. They either reform their worldview, meaning they integrate what Jesus was telling them, or they regress back to a former worldview. They don't generally stay the same. And this is what we see here. They were so upset with Jesus asking them to integrate something that was already in their scriptures that they should have been aware of and integrating. It's like he wasn't bringing something from left field here. They had examples of God being gracious with outsiders in their own scriptures, but they chose to downplay those. Jesus comes along and says, let's flip this over. Let's pay more attention, because he knew what was coming. He knew if they kept this red-blue conquest mindset, that they would be no match for the Romans. And that's just actually what happened. They couldn't conceive of a world where the boundaries that they thought kept them safe would be better. It would be better off to cross those boundaries. So they did what they had always done to prophets. They tried to kill the messenger, kill the prophets. Jesus talks about this in Matthew 23 and 4 when he's talking to the Pharisees. You guys, remember, you killed all the prophets. You didn't like what they had to say. Well, the prophets are calling us to these farther down the road levels of consciousness. The tendency, though, is that as we move along in this spiral, it's easier to start feeling superior to people at the former stages. We shouldn't do that. It's not helpful. We need the former stages to prepare us for the next ones. And at times to complement the later stages here and now. I think this is why we don't see Jesus rejecting certain scriptures outright. He claims not one jot or tittle will pass away from the law. And he says, I didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. He understood that humans need the beige, purple, and red stages. We need those. It's where we develop our moral compass. It's where we develop our sense of right and wrong. It's where we develop codes of conduct that serve us well. But if we're not careful, they become very restrictive and very much tribalistic, and we build big walls to protect those moral codes. So what Jesus is really doing is he's saying, rather than jump up to green or turquoise, I want you to consider both. It's a both and rather than an either or scenario. And spiral dynamics represents it like this. That's why we see hints of all these different colors at different places along the spiral. Because we sometimes have to draw from different stages in the different stages where we live. I'll try to give an example. Like the United States has been predominantly in an orange stage since the Industrial Revolution. Materialistic, individualistic, there's economic rewards for hard work, not too concerned about the environment. Within my lifetime, you couldn't swim in Kenduskeag Stream, or you had to have a tetanus shot to go in the canoe race. Anybody remember that? Yeah, I mean, the Kenduskeag Stream was a mess. What do I do with my water anyway?
It's on
Oh, it's right on my stand. Ah.
You're thinking in need levels much higher.
That's right. But we're transitioning, the United States is transitioning to a green kind of stage. We're more tolerant, expressive, sensitive to inequalities now than they were when I was a kid. We're gaining some concern for the environment where we didn't have it before. This information age that we're in is a different kind of age than the industrial age. It requires different skills, different ways of thinking. But greens can become bogged down and inefficient, because if you allow your concern for inequalities to become so great that you don't know how to run your business, then your business will fail. And so we need sometimes a little blue kick in the pants for us green people, to keep us productive, because you can get stalled in the green, yellow, turquoise phases. You can get so concerned with justice that you can't get anything done. And so that's why I like the spiral dynamics approach. There are other approaches. A guy named James Fowler has a stage theory too, but his is more cut and dry like this. And it's easy to start getting an elitist attitude when you think of it that way. And I don't think we should get elitist about it. I think we should recognize that, remember, this is an observational model. This model was not designed to head societies in any particular direction. It's just that these social scientists observed societies and cultures going back as far as they can find, using sociology and anthropology up through today, and they find examples of all of these worldviews in existence in the earth today. And they've figured out how we get from here to here, to here, to here, to here, to here, to here. And that's why they're in the order that they're in. So they're not trying to steer our future any more than a weather model can steer a storm. But these models are designed to just make us aware of where we might be going and what the course of events that we might go through to get there. So it's just an interesting thing, but don't get stuck on it, because I think that's why I like this spiral, because we recognize that no matter where you are, there's times where you might need a hero. And there's times where you might need a little boot in the pants from a materialistic kind of guy to get us out of a depression or something like that. So there's those kind of things. It's difficult. It's getting difficult today in the United States, because we're transitioning into a kind of a green phase, sometimes to find people to do the kind of jobs that are a little bit more menial. I saw Joe at the airport the other day. He says he was waiting to do an interview with somebody. He says, I can't find enough people to do the housekeeping work around here. Well, it's not because people don't need work. They do need work, but a lot fewer people today are willing to do those kind of jobs than they were 20 years ago. I've heard Bruce say the same thing. So, it's hard to get guys to do roofing. So, but At the same time as it's getting harder to find people to do those jobs here, Tim Cook at Apple says, well, I'd love to make iPhones in the United States, but I can't find enough people to do that kind of work. So they make them in China. Well, in China, they find lots of people that are happy to do that kind of work. The kind of work that we used to be happy to do 40 years ago in the United States, because China is still predominantly a blue country. So there's this dynamic plays out in countries, it plays out in individuals, it plays out all kinds of places. It plays out like if you're what is called a constitutionalist in the United States, you might look at our U.S. Constitution as a sacred text. A lot of people look at our Constitution as a sacred text. But this sacred text was developed at a time when the country was predominantly red, getting ready to transition to blue, 300 years ago. We weren't predominantly in the same stage 300 years ago as we are now. So we can try to continue to interpret the Constitution as if we were a red-blue country, but we're not. We're a blue transitioning to green country. And that's some of the struggles you see going on in society today, where some people say, well, we got to get back to the Constitution and all of these particulars about it. And I think in a lot of cases that's true, because we need a strong document for a country to operate well. But on the other hand, you also have to recognize that we're not the same kind of country that we were 300 years ago. That there have been some changes in the way we think, in the way we integrate with the rest of the world. Fundamentalist Christians look at the Bible as a sacred text in a different way than I look at the Bible as a sacred text. So fundamentalist Christians will have a particular interpretation of this text, and I would differ with them on a lot of those interpretations. Just like when Jesus opened it up to Luke 4, and he read from it in a particular way and drew out examples that really enraged the people that were listening to him. In the same way, what I'm teaching you today would enrage a lot of fundamentalist Christians because it doesn't comport with their interpretation of this sacred text. So Jesus, I think, was pointing us to this kind of awareness. And that's all I'm doing today is just trying to make us aware, and spiral dynamics is just a modern method to make us aware that God has I think he has a trajectory in mind for humanity. I don't think that when Jesus showed up 2,000 years ago, that humanity was as far down the road in social awareness and social development as God wants us to be. And that there is a view called a trajectory view of Scripture, where Derek Flood writes about this. If you're reading Derek's works, you'll read it. That we ought to not stop at where the Scriptures leave off, because the Scriptures leave off with slavery being perfectly fine. The Scriptures can be read to be very restrictive of women. So, but if we look at the trajectory that the Scriptures are on, we can see, they were headed in some direction. And maybe we ought to continue along that same trajectory and see where that might take us. Jesus said on his last weekend before his crucifixion, when he rode into Jerusalem, he wept over the city. He said, if only they had known the things that make for peace. I think that he was getting at this dynamic. He had been trying to teach them, these Romans aren't your enemies. You can look at them as enemies. You can look at them as a foreign tribe, and they're treating you like they're your enemy. But if you continue on with that kind of thinking, they're going to destroy you. They're going to devastate you. And that's actually what happened. In 40 years, they were just nearly wiped out. I think we still need to hear Jesus calling us into the ways that make for peace today. And it may look different in different environments, different in different places, but I think he's still praying that prayer. Okay?